suddenly, out of seemingly left field, you have this victory of Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez, his running mate. And they are actually leftist leaders who have campaigned on things like peace, social justice, environmental justice in a very extractivist based economy, oil based economy like Colombia. Tell me, did this come out of nowhere? Who is Gustavo Petro? Just the fact that I haven't heard of him doesn't mean he was in existence before. Tell me more about him.
He didn't come out of nowhere. He's actually a very known politician. He's been like in the political spectrum for quite a while in this country, at least 30 years. But he always had this figure of being from the opposition and being anti-establishment.
Mm-hmm.
So just to give you a bit of background of him, Petro in 1977 became a militant of the guerrilla of the M19, which was a social democratic guerrilla, urban nationalist guerrilla movement that was not like the Marxist sort of guerrilla that people think are in Colombia. This was different. And he was there for 10 years. Then he demobilized and became a very prominent member of parliament. He denounced and exposed the links between politicians and paramilitaries, these groups that were also illegal, but were from the right wing and were against those guerrillas and were very, very cruel. He also exposed, scandals of corruption, violations of human rights from the state within the conflict of Colombia. And then he became mayor of Bogota, the capital. And he was a very contentious and polemic and polarizing figure because obviously he had a very different agenda to what people were used to in this country. Then he started building this new figure who was trying to become more moderate and more, trying to congregate different spectrums, different branches of political thinking to become president. And that's the buildup. In the last 8 years, he's been trying to build this coalition, which finally made it into the presidency, which is historical because, as you were saying, Colombia has never had a purely leftist president in power. So it's huge.
So he was building this coalition with maybe more moderate candidates, people who weren't as to the left as he was. And that actually worked out for him. Are people afraid that might compromise his values? Or is that sort of what has to be done when you want to gain, that kind of political traction?
There's a bit of everything of what you said, President, because I think that Petro has become quite moderate in the ways that he does politics, right? So he is more pragmatic in the sense that he, builds alliances with people from the political establishment. That doesn't mean that he sacrificed his core, lines of thinking that have to do with social justice, global warming, and inequality. Especially, this is the most unequal country in Latin America and one of the most unequal countries in the world. And that is the main problem that he wants to address. Obviously, it's not going to be easy. There's no re-election in Colombia, and the period's only 4 years. But that is his main thing, and I don't think that has changed. But we're going to see.
So you can't be re-elected.
Yeah,
there's a term limit. One term, 4 years. That's what you get. So sorry, I cut you off there, but I just wanted to highlight, I don't think a lot of people think of Colombia as one of the most unequal countries in Latin America, which is saying quite a lot considering you've got Brazil and Argentina and these other places that have incredible wealth, but then also incredible poverty.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, Colombia it's always rare and it's always difficult to explain. Some correspondent was saying the other day that people who get here, the first day they want to write an article. The second day they want to write like a New Yorker sort of piece. And the next month they don't want to write anything because it's so layered and complicated and full of gray areas that it's difficult to explain. But Colombia is a very fragmented country. And starting with the fact that geographically, it has all sorts of regions that are very different from each other, like two coasts, Andes, savannas, and the jungle. So it's
Mhm.
very diverse in terms of geography and biology, but also culturally and politically and economically. So the country is fragmented in every way possible. And that, in a way, has generated a huge gap between the rich areas and the poor areas. The
Right.
rich areas are in the Andes, which is where I am, Bogota, although Bogota is always different. But the Andes are the rich place, and the two coasts, the Pacific coast and the Caribbean coasts, are less rich. That means that, and that's where Petro won, actually. Petro
Mm.
is his place is the two coasts, whereas Rodolfo Hernandez, the guy who was in the second round, won in the Andes. So that
Mhm.
gap that is in every term, like cultural, political, and economic, it's part of the source of that huge inequality that I think that during the pandemic became so evident,
Yeah.
so cruel, that people just started to get sick of it, started protesting, and it became and it materialized in Petro's election.
So I just want to point out that's really interesting because he being the former mayor of Bogota, where the Andes is, where Hernandez did well, he didn't actually necessarily carry that same area. You're saying that like Hernandez did better in those areas.
Bogota is like the mole within the Andes, because
Okay.
it's a very cosmopolitan and a
Sure.
very open, diverse city. So, and it always, not always, but in the last 20 years has voted for the left. So Bogota is that bit that is different in the
Right.
Andes. The rest of the Andes, so all the
The rich
coffee
burbs.
industry, for instance, which is well known internationally, is that right wing sort of constituency, which voted for Alvaro Uribe, who used to be the president here, and is a very popular figure, used to be, from the right in this country, which people might know from
I
abroad.
remember protesting Uribe from the United States, specifically when Coca-Cola and other countries were like murdering union activists, and we were signing these free trade agreements with the United States. Colombia is
Right.
sort of in my mind as like the place where global financial capitalism is leading to all this death. Anyway, but that's farther down the line.
No, but
Tell
that's a
me,
point. That's a point, because Petro, in a way, wants to change that, and he's
yeah,
addressing that, especially
yeah,
like Francia Marquez, his vice president, who is the first Afro vice president. Well, she's everything new,
yes,
everything that was not represented in this country for 200 years is her. And her background is social activism and environmentalism on the grounds of these, multinational companies that came here and extracted all sorts of things, including gold, that from the region of Francia. So yeah, that is a good point that you remember that, because those are the things that hugely capitalist society and economic system that used to be Colombia, now it's going to be into question, and Petro is going to tackle that. At least I don't know he's going to be able to change it, but he's going to you know
I mean, it's incredible for her victory. I mean, with the two of them is very momentous, especially because of how much environmental activists in South America and Latin America generally are targeted, are murdered. So the fact that she even survived to this point to be able to be elected. And I was reading about how much she, got funds and votes from abroad, from a lot of Afro-Colombians who and other Colombians who live in like New York City. She was campaigning there, for example. It's pretty incredible. And I remember what it was now. It was Plan Colombia that we were all like
right.
protesting. It was like, no to Plan Colombia, blah, 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 blah. We lost that fight.
He
And
lost it until now.
until maybe now. But I do want to talk about, so what happened? What was the perfect storm that led to Petro's election? 2021, I know there was mass uprisings or protests. And how was that related to the pandemic? And how was that related to just issues that Colombia had been dealing with for many years?
You can even go further back, I think. In 1991, so basically in the 80s, what people know abroad is that Colombia was going, it was all about drug dealing. And drug
Right.
dealing got into the political and economic system in a way that no other industry did. And in 1989, that generated huge violence. One of the most prominent presidential candidates was killed. It was a very difficult time, right? And in 1991, the solution for that violence was a constitution. That constitution was very representative of what Colombia is. So very diverse, very progressive, very trying to involve all those people who were excluded for so many, centuries, really. But it didn't take place. Like, the constitution was too ahead of its time. And for the last 30 years, Colombia has been trying to put in place that project of a, diverse, multi-ethnic, multicultural country. And I think that gradually the country has been able to accept the possibility of a politician who represents that, like Petro, in power. Obviously, yes, in the past 6 years, there's that change has gone faster. And I think that's because, first, the peace agreement that the state signed with the FARC rebels in 2016, I think that even though that was not a perfect agreement and the violence is still in place, that opened the door, that opened the window for new sort of worries, preoccupations for Colombians. This is a country that was obsessed with war and conflict and, the Cold War sort of logics between, communists against capitalists.
Right.
And all presidents were elected on that agenda in this country. The conflict was always the main topic of campaigning and elections. This time, it's the first time that the campaign was not about war. It was all about inequality, global warming, social rights, abortion, things like that, normal sort of things of a country, right? So I think that buildup has been going on for the last 30 years, Colombia getting to be a normal country. And then the pandemic, with all this said, the pandemic, showed how poverty is as big as, one of the biggest in Latin America in this country. 50% of people are poor, how inequality is so huge. And one of the main problems here and in other countries in Latin America as well is informality in terms of labor.
Right.
Half of workers don't have a contract, and they have to, get their money from whatever they find the same day that they need the money, right? So when the lockdowns came up, obviously people didn't have any source of income, and the state here doesn't have the capacity or even the tradition to give people assistance in situations like that one. So that generated a very complicated situation, which resulted in these wave of protests in 2019, but after in 2021, which were the most massive and complicated ones. And I think that Petro was, I wouldn't say that Petro is the result of those protests, because he was not the main leader of them, and people who were protesting were critical of them as well. But I do think that the political process that has been going on and that showed that Colombians do protest and do have a link with the political system does result in Petro's election, if you know what I mean.
Right. It wasn't, they weren't campaigning for him, but there's a correlation. I think it's so fascinating that, you understand how war manipulates civil society, right? I mean, in this country, you had, however, 20 years of a war in Afghanistan, and wars in Iraq, war on terror. And in that time, it was like, oh, I'm sorry, none of the social, I mean, I talked about Plan Colombia, which is what sort of, I started off, hey, no to free trade, yay to workers' rights, yay to environmental rights. All that stuff got put on the back burner when we had the war on terror and we had to go get the terrorists, right? So it's amazing. And now Colombia has been living in that state of mentality for so many decades that finally, when there's this glimpse of, hey, let's put this behind us, you have these openings, to actually talk and address real day-to-day issues for people. And I guess I wanted to ask you more about, I think you wrote on Twitter something about like new generations of voters and like how young people have impacted this vote. Can you talk about that?
Yes, because it's not only the demographic change that's been going on and all the new voters that we have, it's also the politicization of civil society. So this is a country that historically didn't vote that much.
Mm.
Turnout was about between 40 and 50%, which is like really low. Um, and in the past 30 years, I think that young people and urbanites, people from the cities have become more close to the political system, have learned what means to have a link with the political system, that you have the right to, because before that protests there weren't protests in Colombia. Basically, you
Yeah.
didn't go protest, because most of the protests from unions and things like that were labeled as guerrilla Marxist sort of things, because that obviously permeated any sort of leftist agenda.
Mm.
So there was no, well, and obviously unionists here are not as many. We have the lowest rate of union representation in Latin America.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
so it's part of the normalization to get people involved, to get people voting. So yes, I think that this time Colombia showed that they have evolutionized and changed and grown up in a way as a democracy, which is pretty big.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do it.